So, Professor, you've just told us about the uprising of the 20,000, when the women's garment workers of New York City flooded the streets in 1909 to protest their working conditions. And this was part of a sort of broader period of women's activism and organizing that the historian and activist Meredith Tax calls the rising of the women. I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about this.
It's a great title, The Rising of the Women, because women did rise in this period in all kinds of different ways and in all kinds of different movements. So just to begin with those sort of middle class women who no longer could tolerate their circumstances, one thinks immediately of people like Charlotte Perkins Gilman, for example. Gilman was a daughter of a rather well-known family, the Beecher family, but her mother was widowed young, and the mother and Gilman herself, the daughters, were raised together, but in a variety of homes of relatives. And Gilman herself, when she married, which she did fairly young, and had a child, and then sank into a deep depression. A depression which grew from the fact that she was lonely, didn't have a purpose in life. Motherhood for her was not a sufficient purpose. And so for her, the rebellion was against the purposelessness or the uselessness of her, what she saw as her existence. So she left her husband with the daughter, left the daughter with the husband. She didn't take the daughter with her, and became herself a rather well-known author, activist, writer, joined the Women's Trade Union League, wrote about women's condition, wrote a novel that we still read today called The Yellow Wallpaper, in which she describes the horrors of this enforced, leisured existence. So she's one of the heroines or the people who rose in that period. But of course there are a lot of other middle-class women who in one way or another rebelled. I think of Florence Kelley as another such woman, the daughter of a judge, grew up in a very, a relatively prosperous, comfortable household, then decided to, went to college and decided to get a PhD, which she could only do in Europe at the time, and went off to Europe, came back, a confirmed socialist, married with 3 children, whom she basically boarded out while she went about the business of trying to better the lives of wage-earning women, and finally, of course, became executive officer of the National Consumers League, a post she held for many decades. So those kinds of women rose, if you like, and then we think about the, let's start with the anarchists, because why not?
Why not?
The name Emma Goldman has become a household word, and she starts out, she's an immigrant, starts out as a garment worker in Rochester, New York, marries, very quickly leaves the husband she marries, but as a result of that marriage, she becomes an American citizen, and that frees her in some ways to play the anarchist role. She moves to New York, she gets involved in the anarchist community, falls in love with Alexander Berkman, and together she and Alexander Berkman create a kind of anarchism, which is an anarchism of the deed, if you like. What's her interest in women at that point? Well, she is interested in the freedom of women to do just what they want to be doing, including what Victoria Woodhull would have called free love. So Emma Goldman had no inhibitions about living with Alexander Berkman, about seeking solace, sexual and otherwise, wherever and whenever she chose. She really believed that women should be free in all the ways that men were free. Went to Europe, got herself a degree, some training in midwifery, came back and made money sometimes as a midwife and as a nurse. But at the same time, she was giving fiery speeches about her desire to overthrow authority and to act as a free person. Then, of course, she couldn't. I mean, for a while, she was a little bit older, but for a while she fell so deeply in love with somebody who wasn't as deeply in love with her, Ben Reitman, that she fell to pieces over that relationship. So, you know, freedom has its barriers, but she was a woman who inspired thousands of other women by her speeches, by her comments, by her lifestyle, and became just an enormous threat to the establishment, if you like, which repeatedly arrested her, repeatedly threw her in jail and she repeatedly got out claiming free speech and you know, eventually was deported because she opposed the war and the First World War, and the federal government could no longer tolerate her. So they deprived her of her citizenship, deprived her husband of his citizenship, or her former husband of his citizenship, and thus deprived her of her citizenship, and she was deported.
So Emma Goldman is, in a way, a wonderful place to begin talking about the rising of the women, because she was connected to so many different efforts and movements. One person she connected with in Greenwich Village was Margaret Sanger over the issue of women's access to reproductive health and birth control.
Yes, and that was an issue that was really on the radical edge in those days. So it wasn't so much that birth control was illegal, though it was, as it was that you couldn't send birth control materials having to do with contraception, etc., through the mails because it was considered obscene to do so. And of course, Margaret Sanger, who we often attribute to the beginning of the birth control movement, began her life at a clinic on the Lower East Side, in exactly the area that we've been talking about, where she noticed the overcrowded conditions and the numbers of children that the poor immigrants were having, and was confronted with people begging for techniques, because everybody knew by then that there were techniques, but that they didn't have them, to prevent babies from being born, conceived and being born. So Sanger began to set up storefront clinics, or set up a storefront clinic, and long lines of women outside the clinic, women with 4, 5, 6 children already, stood outside the clinic begging for birth control. And then Sanger expanded her movement. Now, of course, Emma Goldman was deeply into birth control because one couldn't be an advocate of free love if one weren't into birth control. And so she was a supporter of Sanger's at the beginning. And Sanger then began to publicize her work and her materials, and she was arrested and sent to jail. And she actually wasn't sent to jail. She would have been sent to jail, but she left for Europe because she didn't want to go to jail, and came back a few years later and became just a loud, outspoken advocate through her journal, The Woman Rebel. So there's another example of a woman and a movement. The birth control movement, if you like, really gets itself underway here.